Good morning and happy Wednesday. One VA dude here. Greetings from the most beautiful place in the entire Commonwealth, Central Virginia. Um, well, the big thing in the news right now is I guess you could call it the summit with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin last Friday when they met in Alaska. Now the meeting is with Zelensky and then some of the people in I guess, the EU and NATO. And people are trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen? Zelensky seems to want a ceasefire. Putin and Trump seem to be more focused on a peace deal, okay, rather than just a ceasefire. They want something more permanent. I believe that the fear that Zelensky has is that it's pretty much a done deal that Russia is going to keep part of Ukraine. Some of the people out there saying that, Russia's going to, march all their troops out of the Crimea, out of the Donbass, and back across the border into Russia. And they're going to say, okay, we're the bad guy. We did wrong in Ukraine and we are abandoning. And Putin's going to say, I'm going to turn myself in for war crimes at The Hague. Well, sorry, people, that's not going to happen. Uh, you know, Vladimir Putin acted aggressively towards Georgia in 2008. Bush was president. Then in 2014, he went into Crimea the first time. Nobody did anything about it. Obama was president then. The first time when Trump was president from 2017 to January of 2021, Putin didn't really do anything. In fact, he actually worked in conjunction with the American military to help get ISIS out of Syria. Um, but Putin didn't act and didn't do anything aggressively. Then, when Biden was in office, fall of 2021, Putin amassed troops along the Ukrainian border. Nobody did anything. Biden didn't do anything. NATO didn't do anything. Everybody was aware of what's going on. And with the satellite technology they have up there, they knew what was going on the ground. Nobody did anything. Then in early 2022, I believe it was in February, Vladimir Putin took his soldiers and his equipment and invaded Ukraine. And there's been a state of war there ever since. But nevertheless, there are areas in Ukraine on Crimea and the Donbass area that are full of ethnic Russians who probably have more loyalty to Moscow than they do to Kiev. It complicates the situation even more, but the time to do something about Russia going into Ukraine was 11 years ago. What the question nobody's asking right now, and before you assume I'm pro Putin or pro Russia, I'm not. I'm just stating simple reality. The Russians have been entrenched there for 11 years now. It'd be like trying to get the Russians out of Kaliningrad, which is on the shore of the Baltic, but that's near the Suwalki Gap. I guess you could say it's between Poland and Lithuania. There's a little, they call it an oblast, Kaliningrad. It was given to the Russians after World War II so that they have access to a warm water port. And it's kind of like an easement that goes straight from Russia through the Suwalki Gap into Kaliningrad so that Russia has direct access to the Baltic there. So it's not frozen over all year round like their other, like if they try and go out of St. Petersburg or what's the other one where they have a port? I think it's at Murmansk. Those are frozen a lot. But anyway, to get back on track, the Russians have been in the Crimea for about 11 years now, which, that gives the Russians access to the Black Sea and thus the Mediterranean. A warm water port, if you will. They're not I don't see how I don't see any peace deal that has the Russians just packing up and leaving. Now, is it pleasant that Ukraine is going to have to basically give up territory after they were invaded? Absolutely. Back in the 90s, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial protection, and they got hosed on that deal, undoubtedly. But there's also something that happened. I believe it was George H. Bush when he was president. His Secretary of State had said, NATO's not going 1 inch east. After the wall came down, well, NATO's not going to go farther east. The Germany's reunited, they're in NATO, but we're not going to. Poland's not going to join NATO. Norway and Finland, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, um, Slovakia, Slovenia, all these other countries, all of a sudden, they ended up joining NATO. So they're now right on the border of Russia. NATO sort of encircles Russia. So not that Putin is a good guy. He's not. He's the evil, brutal thug. But in order to defeat an adversary, you have to learn to see things through their eyes. You have to learn, how does this look to Russia? How does this look to Putin? How would the United States feel if the Chinese and the Russians were putting military bases and signing military alliances with Mexico and Canada and Bermuda and the Bahamas and Jamaica, and they were putting, their naval bases in the Gulf of Mexico? We wouldn't be too happy about it. But yet that's how it feels to Russia. They feel like they're being encircled. The Baltic Sea is nicknamed the NATO lake. So there is something to be said from the Russian standpoint. Now, being, former military, I was a Cold War veteran of the Army Reserve. I was never deployed. I was never in combat or anything like that. But, back then our training revolved around, the anti-Soviet Union training, and the Russians were considered our number one adversary back then. And I believe they're still an adversary today, but they're probably not nearly as nasty an adversary as the Chinese. And the Russians don't pose a huge economic threat to us like the Chinese do. But nevertheless, what's going to be the future of this is if we get a ceasefire, as Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, wants. And I have to give the guy credit. He's fighting for his country. He's doing what he can. He's clearly the underdog, but and he's got a lot of corruption in his country, but he is fighting for his nation. And even if your nation has a very corrupt government, you've got a lot of problems, there's still something to be said for your own countrymen. Even though our government does some dumb things, I'm still as patriotic as anybody out there. I still love my people. I love my nation. I sometimes get angry at my government, but I love my country. And I would expect that the average Ukrainian person feels the same way. So is he going to get a ceasefire? Does that just stop hostilities for a little while? If there is a long-term peace deal, and I can't help but think that the Russians are going to keep part of the Donbass and they're going to keep part of Crimea. I don't see any way you're going to expel Russia forcibly from there. Can you use NATO to contain Russia and keep them from doing something else? Yeah, probably. But, I don't see Vladimir Putin, rolling into Lithuania anytime soon or sending his tanks into Poland. I just don't see him doing that. I don't think he wants to have yeah, does he want to rebuild the old Soviet Union? Maybe in the back of his mind, but he knows that's not going to happen. His economy is in shambles. They've got a lot of problems over there. This war is a meat grinder. It's a war of attrition for both the Ukrainian and the Russian people, and a lot of young people are dying for nothing. And that's one of the angles that Trump has. Trump just wants the killing to stop. Trump is not pro Putin or pro Zelensky. He just wants this to come to an end. And I think he realizes that you're not going to get the Russians to retreat and go back into Russia. That's not going to happen. But you can come up with some kind of a permanent peace plan, and that is going to have to involve something. It allows Vladimir Putin to save face. There's going to have to be some way he can get out of this without looking like a coward, because that saving face is very important to him. And there's gonna have to be something in it for Ukraine: economic development, foreign investment, um, military alliance, possibly. But I don't think that's going to work if Ukraine is admitted to NATO. I think that would be a big mistake, and I think that would kind of be a deal breaker. Ukraine has the potential to be a bridge between the East and the West, and to be an important alliance to the West, and yes, become eventually an ally with Russia. The people are very similar. They go back, centuries. There's, the Ukrainians and the Russians, they're both Slavic people. And yes, they have differences, but they're kind of like Americans and Canadians in a way. They're kindred spirits in many ways. But they imagine if they could work out something where you could have American industrial interests on the ground in Ukraine, harvesting rare earth minerals, maybe oil or natural gas, tourism, uh, agriculture production. There are ways that capitalism is going to make Ukraine stronger and have stronger ties to the West, and yet not be a military threat to Russia. And Russia is right next door. They're a very strong country, but um, let people have skin in the game. When people trade with each other and they do business with each other, they're less likely to go to war, because war is bad for business. You kill off a lot of your labor. You kill off many of your young men. That changes your country's demographics forever. It ruins your culture. But imagine people being productive, building things, making things, growing things, shipping things out, exporting. you know, Ukraine is also like the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. Think of the agriculture potential they have over there. And believe it or not, the Russians could exchange in commerce with the Ukrainians. I guess they could buy Ukrainian grain, and then, the Ukrainians buy Russian vodka. I don't know. But when people are more willing to trade with each other, they're less likely to drop bombs on each other. But this war has got to stop. It's just senseless. And I believe there are some nefarious people in the West who prefer a long, drawn out, protracted war, whether it's the weapons industry, some of the globalists, um, the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it. There are people. I mean, look at John Bolton. Have you looked at him lately? Whenever there's a prospect of the United States going to war, his mustache gets bigger. When he starts to look like a walrus, then you know that bombs are going to start falling. But there are people who do want a prolonged war. And I mean, it's sad to say that, but it sure seems that way. But there's got to be a way of working out a permanent peace over here. And I'm sorry to say that some of that is probably going to mean Ukraine is going to give up some territory. But what's the alternative? Keep fighting a war of attrition against Russia, which outnumbers them 3-1, and has tons and tons of nukes, or do you stop the meat grinder and cut your losses, and say, okay, these are mostly Russian areas. Let them, let Russia have that small part of land and go on about your business. There's no, it's not a matter of winning and losing. It's a matter of stopping the war. Yes, I know you can never appease a tyrant, but what are the alternatives here? Continue a war of attrition, and the meat grinder keeps grinding up young men on both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainian side, and eventually possibly get into World War III? Or do you come up with a peace agreement now, stop the war, and begin to let the Ukrainians rebuild their economy and become a productive nation, and possibly eventually become an ally of their neighbors in Russia. Because, Donald Trump's not going to be here forever. Putin's not going to be here forever. And if the Ukrainians had an election, they might even vote to get rid of Zelensky. So, we got to think long term. These people are, the people are going to eventually die, but I mean, the leaders are eventually going to die, but the people in the country are still there. There are kids being born today who are going to have no recollection of Putin or Zelensky or Trump. And, when our generation is gone, don't we want things to be better for the next generation? Just something to think about. I think that this is going to require some very careful negotiation, but I think it can be done. I just don't think it's going to work out that if Ukraine is admitted into NATO, I don't think that's gonna have to be off the table. They can be a powerful, neutral, pro-Western state without being a quote unquote threat to Russia. I think that it's going to take some balls of steel and some very smart negotiators, but I think it can be done. Is Donald Trump the one to do it? Maybe not, but he might be able to facilitate it. And if he can, then good for him. If Biden could have done it when he was in office, then good for him too. But he was probably part of the reason this whole thing happened anyway. But I'm not going to pop smoke at Joe Biden today. I'm not. That's just not the point. Um, but do we get a short-term ceasefire, or do we get a long-term peace agreement? What's more important? Stopping the war, averting World War III, or trying to, jam a square peg into a round hole by making Ukraine a member of NATO? That's probably going to be a deal breaker. But we've got to have cooler heads must prevail, and we need some really, really smart people in on these negotiations. Well, that's about it. I've went on enough for today. I got some more stuff I could say, but I'm not going to. I'll bore you to death. You'll be growing a beard by the time this video ends. All right. Peace out.